I hope you had a fulfilling lunch. Next up, we have our plenary panel on food supply chain and traceability, moderated by Carl Mount, who for one more week will be the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Zaxby's Franchising LLC. Carl will introduce his panel to you. Come on up and give them a warm welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Joe. Okay. All right. All right. Good afternoon. Always a tough spot to be right after lunch. All the blood is in your stomach, not up in your head. The other thing is, for all those of you outside, come make your way back in. Friday afternoon tends to be the lightest attendance that we get at these things. And so I think as soon as Wink got up here and announced, I think half the group went out maybe. But if you are outside and you can hear me, come in. Or students, if your friends, the other students are outside just kind of socializing, get them back in here too. Because this is a supply chain topic that we've been covering at this summit. Quite a few years. I don't know how many years it's been. Has it been 6 years? And so it's one of our reoccurring panels. So before I get a chance to introduce my panelists, let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Carl Mount. I've been in the food and beverage supply chain 40 plus years. It's kind of scary. I graduated from supply chain. Well, we didn't have supply chain as a major at SC when I graduated in mid 80s. But ever since then, I've worked for companies like PepsiCo, Coca-Cola Company, most recently Yum Brands, Starbucks, and then Zaxby's, as you heard. I am leaving at the end of next week. That's been publicly announced. You'll follow me on LinkedIn. You'll know where I end up after that. So that hasn't been quite announced yet. But what I can tell you is that the food supply chain, the very first year we did this panel, we actually had a slide up there to tell people what the food supply chain was. You know, little pictures of the farm and going all the way to the fork and kind of everything in between. Because pre-pandemic, you know what? I don't know if a lot of people really understood the food supply chain, or if they did, they really didn't care because they just went to the grocery store or their favorite restaurant and it was always in stock. You didn't have to worry about it. Food inflation was not a thing. Certainly food fraud has only been something that we've started to talk about over the past probably decade or two. Who would ever think that somebody wanted to tamper with my food and that it could be actually a terroristic risk that we had to worry about? When you think about drought and weather and diseases like avian flu, you know, those are things that we worry about in food supply chain all the time. And then frankly, you know, the biggest thing in the news the last few, probably 9 months, has been the rate of inflation in food and how much of your wallet is spent on food now versus pre-pandemic. And the price of eggs in just the last week has been all over the news as well. And so that's why this topic is important. The other thing that I just wanted to cover briefly with you is a couple of fun facts about the food and beverage industry that you might not know. 10% of the US workforce is in some way or shape supporting the food and beverage industry. So if you think about agriculture, you think about food manufacturing, food logistics, 10%, 1 in 10 of every job in this country is somehow related to that. Curious, by a show of hands, who in the room has ever had a job in a food-related industry? McDonald's, a QSR, anything? So I'd say it's probably more than 10% of the hands that are up in the room right now. Another fun fact, probably not so fun, actually, serious fact. Did you know that we in the US waste 120 billion, with a B, pounds of food every year? 20% of the food that is grown on our farms is wasted before it ever gets shipped off the farm. So it's a big deal, and we have food scarcity in this country, and we talk about how are we going to feed kids at every meal in the summertime when we're wasting 20% of our food. The last little note that I'll leave with you is 70% of the water consumed in the United States goes towards agriculture. So as we talk about water scarcity in the next decades ahead of us, how this industry supports that is important. But you know what? We're not going to talk about any of those things. Those are all topics that we could talk about. But as the panel got together a couple of times in advance of today, because food supply chain is such a broad topic, we said, look, we're going to narrow it down to a couple things that we want to talk to you about. And we pulled together a really distinguished panel that'll introduce themselves in just a second. But we're going to talk today with you about the changing regulatory environment in the food supply chain, and specifically traceability around a few areas on importation, and the need for those of us involved in food supply chain to really be focused, not just on FSMA 204, which we've talked about the last couple of years, but on some other regulations that are coming. So I'm going to kick it over to the panel to introduce themselves first, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. David.
Hey, Carl, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here today. My name is David Stepp. I'm a partner at a law firm, Kroll & Mooring here in Los Angeles. It's a Washington, D.C. based firm. I've spent my entire career focused on international trade and customs and how goods get from one country to another and all the trade regulation associated with that. So I look forward to sharing with you today some of the things that I've been seeing and really kind of in the middle of with respect to tracing and how that really affects importers and consumers and governments alike.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Greg Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. And I've had a 30-year career in executive leadership in the seafood and restaurant and entertainment industry. Much of that was spent overseas in Singapore, in Shanghai, besides all the work I've done here in the US. I've been very blessed in my career to have worked in some of the well-known companies, Darden Restaurants, Caesars Entertainment, US Food Service, airline catering organization that was also doing C-store catering, and a few other smaller organizations, also in food safety and in standards. So I'll be bringing a perspective that's a little bit different from that idea from what our lawyer is bringing.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Demetrius Gagas. I work for Levitt Foods. We're a meat manufacturer and further processor operating under the Branding Iron Ranch brand, BIR. I'm going on my 17th year in my career in the food industry, predominantly on the produce side as a shipper, consolidator, and distributor. So not quite the final mile, but that distribution part in between everything from end to end. But I've held various roles from the growing side all the way up to, again, the consumer side. And again, a little bit widespread from produce into the meat or protein end of the industry. And I'm from cohort 9 from this program. So if there are any, I don't see anyone from my cohort in here. But anyways, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored to be on this panel with these industry experts. So thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm Ron Volpe, and I appreciate USC inviting me back to be on the panel again. The last couple of years, I was the moderator, but I think they found that I'd asked the questions and I'd answered my own questions. So they thought, let's bring in somebody else that will actually let other people talk. So I will be the person doing it. I also want to apologize. Last year, I mentioned, talked about food mislabeling and talked about shrimp, and 40% of the shrimp is mislabeled. And I met somebody at the reception the other night, and they said they hadn't eaten shrimp since the last time they came to this event. I forget who it was, but he said, I haven't eaten one shrimp since that day. I am the CEO and co-founder of a new venture called TraceChain.ai. I'll talk more about that during this. My background is largely food supply chain. So I was with Kraft Heinz for many years in many places, running supply chains. I went to Australia, ran supply chain for Coles supermarkets in Australia out of Melbourne for many years. And then the last 5 years, prior to starting this up, I was in the Danish tech space with 2 startups, one called TradeShift and a second one called PSQR, which was a traceability software company working in the tobacco space. So last thing about me, I think of myself as a design thinker. I heard somebody else say that. I spent several years working with IDEO in Palo Alto on a joint venture with Kraft. So I think of myself as that from a supply chain perspective. So that's it.
As you can see in their own words, we've pulled together a great panel. So I'm excited to be able to ask them some questions and then give some time for you guys. David, you're the lawyer on stage. And so, give us some insights, if you would, why must supply chains be traced? Kind of what's the rationale behind it? We said regulatory and import was going to be the focus, not FSMA so much this year. Give us your take on that, if you will.
Sure. My career as an international trade and customs attorney, kind of the run-of-the-mill issues I deal with are tariff classification, free trade agreements, entry issues, kind of the run-of-the-mill stuff that I still do every day. But over the past 2 years, the traceability of supply chains has exploded. And that's in one reason due to forced labor laws that have been enacted here in the US. Goods that are made in whole or in part, quote unquote, in whole or in part with forced labor are banned from import into the US. So conceivably, you could have a machine with one screw in the machine that was made with forced labor would be left out. So in focusing on the food industry, I've had a lot of experience in the agricultural industries in Southeast Asia, as well as seafood and some other things. And with the forced labor law in the US actually banning the imports, it's really been a sea change for a lot of companies. In addition, there's been the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that went into effect a couple of years ago, which is banning the import of goods made in China with in the Xinjiang region or made with forced labor, unless you can show that there's no forced labor in that supply chain. Again, an import ban. There are a lot of industries that are being focused. One of the first products focused on was tomatoes coming out of China. But again, there is a lot going on with the traceability because you have to, if your goods are detained by US Customs, you've got to show traceability documents back to those raw materials, back to the farm. And that's transportation documents, commercial documents, payment documents. And as you can imagine, that's pretty impossible. It has been impossible, becoming more possible as companies realize they have to do this. One other area that's of really interesting is deforestation. In Europe, there's a new deforestation law that goes into effect at the end of the year, and it's really going to be focused on commodities such as beef, cocoa, sugar, wood products, several other ones. And so companies to sell the goods within Europe are going to have to demonstrate that the goods were not grown or raised on lands that were deforested prior or after, December 31st, 2020. So you can imagine what that traceability chain is going to be required for that. Already, China has said no geolocation will be provided or allowed out of China for national security reasons. So for the first time in the last couple of years, traceability has really been at the forefront of what's going on.
Maybe just one quick follow-up on it. A lot of times in the US, we think we're the leaders in everything. Tell us a little bit about this is a global supply chain summit. So, what areas of what regions of the world are actually leading in some of this as opposed to the US? Because I know it's not the US.
Actually,
and maybe I'm wrong.
Actually, the US is leading in the forced labor human rights area in that the legislation actually is an import ban, whereas in the UK, it's actually just been an anti-forced labor statement showing what you do, but imposing no requirements. The same in Australia and Canada. So this import ban has really been a phenomenal change. Now, Europe has passed the CSDDD new legislation, their forced labor regulation that goes into effect in the future, it's soon, which will actually go beyond the US. It will not only be an import ban, but it will ban the sale of goods made with forced labor within the EU.
Well, I just learned something, so that was great. I thought we were a fast follower, and it sounds like in this case we're not. Hey, let me move over to Greg for the next question, just real quick. Greg, you work for a group that's overall of seafood. So talk to me a little bit about what are the key motivations of the seafood space, whether it's production or marketing companies, to adopt single standards around traceability?
Thank you so much. So the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability is an industry consensus group that came up with a single standard for traceability of seafood. And the three major drivers that drove are driving traceability in seafood are first regulatory, and that's where we were just talking about, David was just talking about, but there's also supply chain transparency that's really important. Customers, buyers of seafood, especially big retailers, restaurant chains, they want to know where was my food's origin from? Where was it processed? Who processed it? Was it caught under proper regulation, or was it anti-IUU regulation? So these are all supply chain transparency. And then, of course, you have your environment, your governance, good governance, and your responsible sourcing, which we call sustainability drivers. So those are the three major drivers. But I'd like to give maybe some examples of what David was just talking about. In the forced labor side, we had just seen a few months ago a huge drama in seafood where Chinese suppliers to major supermarkets and supply chains came up short on traceability for their supply chain, and groups that were interested in objectifying abuses of forced labor got in there and were able to objectify that these seafood suppliers to some of our biggest and most famous retailers had actually missed that there was forced labor, and that forced labor was taking place in Zhejiang, the region where the Uyghurs are in China. So this was a big drama in the seafood space. It has shed the light on the real possibility of abuses occurring with forced labor in the supply chain. Those shipments were rejected. Those retailers have walked away from those suppliers. There's a big issue in the seafood space right now, just directly related to what David was talking about. So these things are real. They're happening in real time. And the solution to it is traceability. A lot of those companies that got caught in that have come to the global dialogue and have asked, where's the traceability solution, so that we can objectify good practices, so that we're not caught without the proper documentation, without the data sets that can show properly that we've been doing our job. And so it's a very real landscape that we're working with.
Great. I'm going to shift over to Dimitri. Dimitri, you on the panel represent, a US based kind of manufacturer. You're the last mile before the retailer. Tell me kind of how these changes, whether it's regulatory, whether it's ESG type of things like Greg mentioned, these are pain points that you've got to juggle. So how do these shift in the marketplace, your customer expectations, your product availability? Kind of what impacts does it have on you? Is that financial stuff? How are you thinking about this?
Well, to start out with, anytime any new regulatory compliance is brought up, or new obligations as far as traceability are implemented, you have to look at your process or your operation from end to end. Now, from a supply side, if ethical practices are being questioned, or proper documentation isn't being provided from, say, one supplier, but that's a primary supplier of yours, obviously you can't be dealing with that person, or that grower or that producer or that rancher. Now, in that case, that might significantly affect your bottom line and your top line, because now you may be in a contract for 500,000 pounds of raw material a week that you have to now shift and scramble around to fill your orders, to meet your production and demand needs. That being said, you're going to be having to be worked into production on the meat side. Being worked into production with a new supplier isn't as simple as making a phone call. Beef has a 2-year cycle for the most part. Poultry is not right away. Same with pork and seafood as well, because of contracted areas that people have to source from. So that being said, you have to wait for your turn. Essentially, that holds up production. That holds up your operational flow. Pricing structures that you've already worked into your formulations are now going to be affected because you're paying more for that product. But the end goal is to comply and to, create a better landscape for the traceability itself. And in turn, the consumer will be taken care of, because at the end of the day, people first, right? We have to make sure that the food that we are consuming is safe, and of course, ethically sourced. You know, we were talking, David had mentioned deforestation and land situations where, you know, there are also situations where land had been used for growing product in specific regions. I'm not going to name specifically who and what and how, but growers had been operating and cultivating on land that was contaminated years prior. There were contaminants within the soil. Now that product you're growing is inherent of whatever that was there prior. So that means down the line, people are going to get sick, or they could get sick potentially. Or, you know, water sources we had mentioned too. We see an E. coli outbreak somewhere, sometime. It happens often. A lot of times it's related to water, whether it be stagnant water sitting in piping that is, you know, filled with bacteria or not. This is where traceability comes in, and ethical practices, and all your processes following not just the guidelines, but I'm always the type of person that goes further and over exaggerates what I'm trying to do in order to make sure that we're maintaining and in compliance. So, you know, from a traceability standpoint, and which is, like you said, grown and blown up and tremendously over the last 14 years or so, because before it was simply just a matter of, okay, where's this product from? Mexico. Great, write it down. That's all we need. Now it's a lot more involved, right? And I think we can all agree on that. And you know, it's becoming more digital too, which I think is a great thing, because, you know, provide all the documentation physically, but now you're having to call and go back and forth to customs at the Canadian border or wherever it may be, and you're missing one carbon copy of something. Now you have to call Holland, or you have to call, you know, wherever else you sourced it from. Hopefully they're awake. They can fax you. They can scan you. That's an archaic term, right? They can scan you that document that you now have to print out, then also send to customs, send to your customer, send to the driver. Each of them have to have a printout, and hopefully you have someone awesome at customs that's going to allow that, because it wasn't originally there, you know, or else they sequester the load. You know, on the digital side of it, I'm digressing a little bit, but that's where it helps out too. But product crosses and changes hands quite often. You know, Carl mentioned 1 in 10 people have worked within the food supply chain. That's a lot of hands that product's touching before it gets to the end user, right? Just on the distribution side. So in a world of trying to minimize the margin of error, it seems like we're expanding it, right? So anyways, that's why traceability is extremely important, you know, to keep the people and the consumer safe.
Thank you, Dimitri. I think if we were playing the drinking game, we probably would have to take about 20 shots so far, because you've heard traceability so many times in the last couple minutes. So I'm going to ask Ron, how do you define traceability? Because we've heard it so many times, and obviously it can be delivered in lots of ways. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you're going to hear me talk today a lot about reframing the narrative, and I'm going to do a little bit of it right now. So let me answer the question directly. Traceability is really the tracking of product through production or growing, through processing, through transport, all the way to the end consumer. So tracking not just the product, but the components, pharmaceuticals that might have gone into an aquaculture operation, packaging, anything that goes with the product, and tracking all of those in a discrete manner, at a granular manner, from end to end. And I come from, previous to starting a new company, with a company in Denmark, where we were working in tobacco. And in tobacco in Europe, every individual pack carries a unique serial number. So you're tracking everything from manufacturing site to the consumer at a very discrete level. That's what we're moving to. And what I saw in that example was 7 years ago, nobody was tracking tobacco. And then 7 years later, everybody was tracking tobacco. Here are the two things I want to reframe. And my co-panelists have done a great job. One is around regulation. So I look at regulation different. And what I mean by that is, I don't look at it, and I've been on a million calls with companies and industries that are pushing back on a lot of the regulations. I don't see it as a bad thing. I actually view it as adding value to value chains. And what I mean by that is, over the last 10 years, consumers, NGOs, have all been pushing for more transparency into the supply chain. How did my product get made? What footprint did it leave? Is it safe? All of that. And I would say, you know, not just in food, but in every industry, there was pushback. And we really never got to very far. And certainly in the food industry, where I come from, it was always just one up, one down. You were tracking where it went, you were tracking where it came from. So I view regulation as pushing and putting into law and codifying what consumers have been asking for 10 years, which was transparency into where all this product was made. How did it get to me? Were slaves using the production of it? So I view that as a really good thing for the consumer, for the planet, for enterprises. The other thing I want to reframe a bit is why do traceability? Kind of the point of entry here in this conversation is regulation. Yes, regulation is required, requires traceability. There's a penalty phase in many of these regulations. Fortunately, and I'm digressing, but fortunately, out of 85 countries with them, the same taxonomy is used in terms of critical tracking events and key data elements. So all of that is happening. The reality is, though, the value in traceability is well beyond the fact that you're complying with a regulation. You run a better business and you run a better supply chain with the data that you're collecting. You can improve efficiency, you can reduce risk, you can improve operational excellence, you can improve customer service. There's a myriad of things you get out of traceability. I think that's the narrative. I think we're getting better. I think the Planet Tracker Group has done a couple of studies where they've done apparel, they've done seafood. I think the GDST was a part of that, where they talked about here are line item by line item in the P&L, what traceability data will do for your organization. I think that's the second thing we need to change the narrative on, which is, yes, you got to comply. Reality is where the benefit is how you use that data.
Thanks, Ron. Hey, Greg, let's go back over to you. Now that Ron's kind of explained a little bit and defined traceability, talk to us a little about the challenges that the seafood supply chain has around globally implementing that definition of traceability that Ron just took us through.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's big challenges, but big benefits. And thank you for accentuating the benefits. That's huge. The challenges that come from it is, I don't know if all of you know, but seafood is the most widely traded commodity protein in the world. There's no protein more widely traded. And so it's facing regulatory constraints, it's facing taxation, customs border protection, all of the different elements that international trade. 80% of the seafood in the United States that's sold is not from the United States. It's only 20% that's grown and raised here. So that gives you an idea of just the crazy complexity of the seafood supply chain. So the first problem that you're facing is that you have this regulatory hurdle you have to get past, not only the country of export regulations, but the country of import regulations and fair labor and food safety. And we have a food safety law that's been well discussed with this panel, but that's imminent. 2 years from now, it'll be in place and everybody has to comply, or at least 80% of the products that come into the United States have to comply to that. So that's the first big problem, is complexity. And how do you deal with the complexity? The second big problem from that is there's a gap between the producer and the consumer. Seafood is one of the least coherent supply chains, in the sense that you have major companies. Almost all the other proteins are much older, much better developed proteins. They're older in their business cycle. Seafood's a relatively young protein. It's the youngest of them all. So seafood tends to struggle with the fact that there's a lot of intermediary steps. You have a lot of brokers, you have a lot of traders, you have a lot of people in the seafood space that you wouldn't have necessarily in the other proteins. And so that adds a second level of complexity. And then the third thing is, seafood doesn't have the big organized advocacy groups like the Milk Council, the Dairy Council, the Beef Council, chicken, and so that's why seafood has been pushed to the front of all of these sustainability initiatives. Seafood didn't have the organizations to so-called protect them from regulation the way the other proteins have. And they got forced to comply more quickly with the HACCP law. And from 1997, we were on the front line of HACCP compliance. We were on the front line of dolphin safe tuna and all the NGO initiatives, which used to be mangrove farming. Now it's deforestation. So all of those initiatives forced seafood to have to face up to regulation. And When Obama signed the upgrade of the Food Safety Modernization Act, seafood got a 2.5-year pass because it was so far ahead of the other proteins. They had to let the other proteins catch up. So these are sort of the challenges that seafood faces, but all challenges end up making you stronger. And in this case, it has with seafood.
That's great. And next time you have shrimp or ahi tuna, now you know a little bit of the complexities that come behind that for sure. Hey, David, one of the things that I always ask my attorneys is, okay, these regulations and all this stuff is great. What happens if I just don't do it? What's the risk that I'm taking as a company if I just decide to ignore it?
You're at your own peril. You may slide through for a while. But as we see, like taking seafood as an example, but also Greece, there are plenty of tariffs that can and implications.
Check.
Can we turn this?
You hear me? Yeah. So at your own peril, as I was mentioning, just for example, in the seafood industry, there are anti-dumping duty, special unfair trade duties applied to certain shrimp coming from Vietnam. There are the forced labor bans for goods coming off of vessels in the South Pacific using forced labor and Uyghur labor. So if you shut your eyes to this, you're going to wake up one day, your customs broker is going to call you and say, we can't get these goods through customs, and unless you provide the documentation that you don't have. Another situation is you might have a 100% anti-dumping duty applied to a certain product. Certainly kills any sort of profit margin you might have. So, and then there are other enforcement actions such as penalties, which can be a multiple of the actual value of the goods themselves. So there really are a lot of risks out there for companies that don't do their due diligence.
Can I add something sorry, to David's point, and David is far more an expert in regulation than I'll ever be, but I think that one of the things I think about is your companies have a choice. Regulation can either be an existential threat to their business because they can't comply, they can't get the product into market, they can't ship it to customers, or it can be a competitive advantage. And I think that that's the decision, and that's the where we're at. And I think companies are figuring that out. I think more and more that we need to explain to companies, not just that, yeah, it's a pain to comply, but you can gain competitive advantage by being a company that complies with these regulations to the letter.
That's definitely the case. In fact, we really encourage our clients to be on the front end of this, to really be the market leader, because by being the market leader in ensuring that your supply chains are safe, that they're ethical, that you've not trading at unfair prices, you really can get a leg up and control the market.
I'm doing what I'm not supposed to do, but I'll do one last comment on this one, which is, and I saw a write-up in the Harvard Business Review this year that talked about Publix, which is a big food retailer in the South. They have the highest percentage of customer loyalty, and they have the highest percentage of transparency given to the products in their stores. So there's a direct correlation between consumers wanting transparency, giving it to them, and having that regulate and having that level of transparency drive foot traffic into the stores. So.
Ron, you're running right into the question I was going to ask you next, which was some of the benefits that come from that. So that example of Publix is absolutely one of the benefits. But with the benefits there, obviously traceability is not free. There's cost and investment in it. Talk to us a little bit about that investment, but then with the benefits there, why are we as companies a little slow on the uptake? Because this is we've been talking about this traceability for a while now, and it's not making huge progress.
I give you three points. I think one, and somebody spoke about it earlier today, there's an interoperability challenge, right? From a technical perspective. So you in food supply chains, very complex, many players in there, but interoperability in terms of sharing data across is sometimes very challenging. And things like EPSIS 2.0 from GS1, very helpful, but interoperability is one. Second piece is trust. And I've been on the other side. Look, I've been on the manufacturer side and I've been with a retailer for a long time. And I can tell you in both cases, when I was with Kraft, we didn't trust the retailers. And when I was with Kohl's in Australia, we didn't trust the manufacturers. So sharing data is always a challenge. We had a data sharing program 10 years ago. My former boss, Philippe Lambot, did a great job leading that at Kraft when we were there. But it's always been a challenge and we're getting better. But I think companies need to understand that you can improve your operation by sharing that data. Trust, interoperability. Oh, last one was, well, in the name, I use a tagline with a company called "Everything is Traceable." What I left off was "if you want it to be." And this woman in Asia that's a leader in the sustainability space, named Ada Greenberry, coined that phrase. And what she was saying is everything is traceable, but many companies have refrained from doing that because they know they have a problem in their supply chain and they're culpable if they release that information. So I've talked to many companies in my past life in the last 5 years who said, you know what, our lawyer said we can't even talk to you. We have issues, we know it, but unless somebody forces us to, we can't release it. Now what you've got are legislation that requires that, and all of that information is coming to light, which I think is good for everybody here.
I was only blaming our lawyers, not me.
Hey,
It's a
hey.
great thing.
David's my favorite lawyer. I gotta say that.
You know, kind of have add-ons to kind of what Ron was talking about, so you raise your money.
Sure, if I may chime in, to Ron's point, the complexity side of data sharing, it's one thing, as he had mentioned, and a few of us had also mentioned, the stronghold on that people have or companies have on releasing information, right? And once they finally break that barrier and they do, it's all specific to their platform, their proprietary platform that they operate off of. And so now you in the middle as a distributor or as a manufacturer or as a consulting agency, you're sitting there trying to dissect and integrate everything from 5 different platforms. And in time, maybe you'll get through about half of it, but we've already gone on to the next generation of tech that's going to be used for that. So there was that. And then so that causes an issue, right? But then again, I do understand the importance of discretion in that regard, because if you're a growing company, a small company, medium-sized or large company, you want to protect your assets and protect what you've built. So I completely get both sides of it. There was another point I wanted to make, but it's slipped my mind. I'm sure I'll remember it shortly. Oh.
Just one thing, I know one thing, as we're talking here about companies upstream in the supply chain not willing or not necessarily participating in the sharing of the information and the data for the tracing exercise. It's something that, tracing is really a requirement these days, or it's going to be pretty much a one that most, if not all companies are going to have to face. And I think, working with your attorneys contractually, it's very important to protect yourself and putting provisions within your supply agreements and your to ensure that not only that your tier 1 supplier provides you that information, but they cascade those requirements upstream back to the source of the products themselves. Because by doing that, that gives you some leverage, not always necessarily enough, but it's a foothold into getting this process underway.
Hey, let me ask you another question, Dimitri. Obviously, regulatory isn't the only reason for traceability. And you as kind of that final step for the retailer, you also have to manage things like, excuse me, like organic or grass-fed. If it's not a meat product, vegan. Consumers are always asking for what is their niche that they want traced. What's your thoughts on this kind of bleeding over or spreading out to other things?
Thank you, Carl. Well, those specific categories, a lot of the time are, related to health, right? Because of your health situation, you have to eat a specific type of food or consume a specific type of food. So the traceability aspect of it ensures that, okay, if I'm getting vegan only products, I know I'm getting that. I know where the food's coming from, how it's being produced. There's no integration between recipes, seasonings, cross-contaminating between proteins and things of that nature. But I do see the landscape changing a little bit over the next decade with traceability and how we're adjusting. We've adjusted the baseline for requirements, right? What for perspective, what organic was 10 years ago, conventional is now, right? it's, you know, our processes are becoming cleaner. They're becoming more streamlined and in my opinion, much, much better. You know, you look at vertical indoor farming and how, you know, automation takes a bit, you know, plays a big role in that, but, you know, trying to keep everything in-house wherever you are in the world. And that helps with traceability because now you're eliminating 8 or 9 different steps in the process. But again, I really do feel as if the baseline is being adjusted going in the right direction from a produce perspective, and you know, more importantly from the protein side too, because a lot more can be detrimental to somebody's health on the meat side, and more importantly, it happens more often than we think. So, does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Follow it up, but Greg, when you think about seafood, and it's a similar question, but what benefits does a normal consumer like me get if I kind of know where my seafood was going? Why should I care?
Thank you so much for that. So let's be clear about what consumers expect. I think if we understand what consumers expect, the Walton Family Foundation did a big survey of consumers, and what they found out was an overwhelming majority of consumers want sustainable, fairly and legally produced product. But the consumer is not going to go and dig into all that detail to figure out where this fish came from and how, you know, that's not their job. They hold the retailer and the restaurant chain and the caterer responsible for that. If I'm going to give my loyalty to this retail unit, as Ron just pointed out, I want to know that you're looking out for me to put on your shelf a product that's sustainable, it's correct, it wasn't illegally produced. That's your job. So in the old days, everybody was talking about what are the consumer facing logos. But really what those consumer facing logos, BAP, MSC, ASC, these are all seafood logos that you may understand, you know, best aquaculture practices, Marine Stewardship Council, aquaculture stewardship. What do those logos mean? Those logos mean brand protection for the retailer, because the retailer saves themselves the risk. Those buyers, retail buyers, and I was a major restaurant chain buyer, that's what allows you to sleep well at night, that my suppliers are doing their job to make sure that I don't get illegal product, that I don't get. So the benefit that occurs is that you end up getting a higher grade product and a more legally, sustainably produced product. But what the benefit is on the production side is that levels the playing field. If you have those standards that are being exercised, whether they're certification standards or rating standards or just your own purchasing standards, what that does is that levels the playing field. Now, it's not just the big dogs who can feed into this supply chain. The little guys too, who have a chance to meet those standards, can be eligible and can produce product. And that's where Ron was going with those traceability solutions. Some of the biggest benefit will not go to the bigger guys. They'll get the big contracts for sure, but the little guys get a chance at those big contracts. The little guys get a chance to feed into those supply chains and sell their wares. And don't even talk about fishery improvement projects and aquaculture improvement projects who really need that benefit because they're struggling fisheries that are trying to achieve a higher level. Those doorways open up for them too. So the benefits are just all around. You reduce the illegally caught stuff, you reduce the shysters and the cheaters in the thing. Because why? The light of day that shined tends to brighten the dark corners, and they have to recede into the smaller dark corners to do their illegal work.
That's true.
Can I add something to Greg? Sorry. And I think this is a bit of a definition, but the way to think, and Greg, keep me honest, the way to think about GDST or MSC or ASC, if you look at the FDA, you've got a program that applies to vegetables, fruit, meat, fish, a bunch of stuff, eggs. I think the way I've always interpreted the great, because Greg and I have worked together for 3 or 4 years, the work that GDST does, MSC, ASC, that adds another level of KDEs and within critical tracking events to boost up, I guess, the performance of the supply chain. So they're invaluable, MSC, ASC. They go alongside, and at least in the way I think of it, some of the more corporate government regulations that are out there.
Absolutely. And those major certifications are all aligning with the GDST standard and are adopting elements of the GDST's traceability standard into their certification standards, because a unified way of talking allows us all to communicate seamlessly without having the drawbacks of we can't understand each other. So even that works the same way in data as it works in language. We all speak English, we all understand English. That's why we are all communicating, right? Well, it's the same thing in data. When you all speak the same data and all the critical tracking events and key data elements that Ron's been talking about are defined the same way, then suddenly everybody's exchanging the data seamlessly, interoperably, and there's no dark corners anymore.
Thank you. Ron, I'm gonna ask you the last question. Before I ask them the last question, be prepared to ask your questions. So start thinking about it, because we're gonna line you up just in a second. But Ron, I know that a lot of the theme of this conference has been around AI. And we've talked a lot about traceability. The name of your company is TraceChain.ai. So help us understand why that AI is there and how does that kind of tie in with the AI we've been talking about last day?
So I'm going to answer and then I'm going to cheat. So here we go. So the answer I'd give you is that as I look at supply chains and my experience in food supply chains specifically, is invariably there's blind spots within that supply chain, both in terms of where the data resides, both in terms of where the data needs to come from. And to my point earlier, right now, we're good at tier 1 suppliers, we're not great at tier 2, and we're terrible at tier 3 and 4 in most industries. So AI is super helpful in the way we view it, will be very helpful for us to be able to capture information and much information that we might not otherwise be able to locate. The part that I'm going to cheat is I happened last week because I saw this question coming because he sent it to me in advance. And I read this, and the worst panelists in the world are ones that read things to you, and here we go. So I read this article in the Food Safety Magazine last week, and it said, data collection is an important component of AI performance. For food safety, data sources include online databases, sensor data, genomics data, social media. However, the diversity of the data also presents difficulties, making it hard to find pertinent information within a data source and its relationship to other data. AI offers the opportunity to assist with compiling this information in a much shorter period of time while processing much larger data sets than a human being could. So I think hopefully we're saying the same thing, but AI is super helpful. And I'm sorry I read things to you. I won't do it ever again, but that's the way I view it.
No, go ahead.
I want to touch on that as well, Ron. Thank you for reading that. What he had mentioned was, in a great, in real time, right? AI will assist in that. Now we look back in traceability terms, let's say in the produce industry, 10 years ago, there was an E. coli outbreak. It came out. People were made aware of it, but we don't know the label. We don't know the brand. We don't know the packaging. We don't know if it was value added, chopped, whole, cello, whatever it may have been. 4 weeks later, it's released. Okay, it was this brand. It happened in either this state or this state amongst this lot number, this lot number, this lot, 5, 6 lot numbers. So don't eat these. Okay, but it's 4 weeks later. This is a perishable item. If anyone's eaten it, it's long gone by now, right? And if it hasn't been, it's decomposed, it's off, and we're already on to the next crop. Now, with AI especially, in real time, we've sped up that process. In my opinion, it's still somewhat slow, but then again, there's a lot of steps that need to be taken in that process to, find the answer, right? And you can't just start naming off brands or labels because you could potentially destroy a brand that way. So anyways.
Yeah, just very briefly. Can you hear me? Yeah. Very briefly, I know that like in the forced labor area and other compliance areas, there are tools out there that use AI to help trace supply chains or at least flag those bad actors upstream in the supply chain. And actually the government is subscribing to some of those tools. So it's here to stay, and it's really a due diligence step that companies really need to start thinking about as they move forward in this traceability exercise.
All right, we're gonna open it up to questions. Let's start here in the front.
Okay, question for the whole panel. Thank you for highlighting the complexity of your supply chain. Who's responsible for reporting the data? As a forwarder, I sit in the middle of that, and I have a brokerage team. And by the way, US Customs, I don't think really is a big fan of AI. So it's a really not automated process. So who ultimately is reporting, because I'm the one that has to tie into both sides. So I need to kind of prioritize that.
Go ahead.
Well, from the import side, when the importer files its customs entry with its customs broker, there are, I think, over 100 data elements that go and that are reported through a software that goes to the Census Bureau. So that's probably I guess the front line from the import transaction.
So thank you for bringing up that question. That's absolutely pertinent. GDST was blessed to have been asked to participate in the recent dialogues that occurred in Washington, D.C. regarding the seafood import monitoring program. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And that's a provenance anti-IUU exercise, meaning illegal. But it's also turning into a forced labor mitigation situation. And so it's not disappearing. The good news is the government is completely open to the opportunities that AI can give to the government to make things easier and to make the data easier to collect and easier to pass forward. And they're listening to custom brokers, and there was some brokers and representatives of your industry all through that meeting. And I can tell you that they're taking in that. Now, what comes out, we don't know, but they're taking in that input. And I'm hopeful that those regulations, and we know SIMP has been difficult, those regulations are now their pathway to become much less complex and much more easy to implement.
Thank you for that question. All right back in the middle here. We can get him a microphone, that'd be great. Let us know who you are and then ask the question.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I work for GS1, so my question is going to be. Thank you, I appreciate it. I'm curious, as you all are talking about standards and technology, what are some of the standards and technology that y'all have implemented to prepare for FSMA 204?
Do you want me to take?
You take that, Ron. I know you have some insights on that.
Okay. So from the standards perspective, because he's implementing on the technology side, but I represent the standards. So a GS1 is a normative core standard of the GDST standard. So thank you. And EPCIS is the protocol that's overlaid on the GS1 base. So we are absolutely in line with your organization and the good work that you have to pioneer through that. For those of you who are not familiar what he and I are talking about, GS1 is the barcoding base that almost anything you buy in a grocery store, that little barcode that goes ding, 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 ding when he goes to, and racks it up, that's all GS1 technology. EPCIS is a language protocol that's on top of that. So the opportunity came in using this generally accepted barcoding and GTIN strategy that GS1 brings to the table. We were able to adapt that specifically to the seafood supply chain. And we are able to produce and get consensus, industry consensus toward a standard that leverages those facilities to create a fit for purpose solution for seafood. And in a lot of ways, what we have with GDST is a pilot program for all the other proteins. The other proteins, as I pointed out earlier, are laggards in the race. They're slower. They have industry groups that protect them. Seafood's on the fronting edge of this, and seafood is having to figure out all these solutions. So I can guarantee you that GS1 is looking at how GDST fares in the marketplace to see how those standards can be adapted. I hope that answered your question, sir.
I'll just weigh in on what, I agree with everything Greg said. I mean, the two words that come to me are standards and taxonomy. So from a standards perspective, I think, as I said earlier, I think that things like GS1, EPCIS 2.0, and I didn't know you were here, so that plug was unintentional, but I think EPCS 2.0 is critical for interoperability. And then from a taxonomy perspective, I mean, and this is one of the things we're facing into in globally is got 85 countries all with ESG or food safety regulations. How do you harmonize those? I think fortunate thing is the taxonomy of critical tracking events at KDEs is consistent across those regulations. And I think that gives me hope that we can bring that all together over time.
Yeah, and I can quickly speak to being a food, a QSR retailer. GS1 probably is going to be the biggest one that most of us will use. There's a few people playing with RFID. Certainly, the tough thing with RFID is a chip, and you put it on each case, you put it on each bottle, those kinds of things. And there's a few playing with blockchain. There's a few playing, with a couple other technologies as well. But I think a lot of us are looking at GS1 as the most logical, fastest path to traceability.
And Carl, something Carl just said, I think I was going to have a closing statement is it takes a village to deliver traceability. I can't do it alone. None of us can do it alone. It really takes a village. And I think, and I didn't think of it until just now, but you've got a lawyer, you've got somebody from a standards body, you've got somebody that's an operator, you've got somebody that's a solution provider. I think that's just an example of the fact that none of us can do it alone. You've got multiple players, you've got hardware, you've got software. So it takes a village, and I think it's these kind of forums that help us get to a better place.
Yeah, we had one of our panels a couple of years ago, whether it was last year or 2 years ago. Julie McGill was on the panel. She was with GS1 before and with the provider now. I think we got time for one last question. Yes, right here in the middle. Yeah, that's you. There we go.
Hi, I'm Sage, and I'm a MS master's student here at GSCM in the cohort 12. So first of all, thank you so much for sharing your insights on the food supply chain. So my question is more geared toward the AI and how the food supply chain kind of uses or employs AI system to in the risk management process. So from my understanding, food is more likely to be fragile to, unexpected things such as maybe like environment, weather, dispute, or perhaps like a consumer behaviorism changes. So I just want to know if AI are implemented in your companies in terms of understanding or being prepared for any risk management.
I'll start that one off. I would say we're early stages, certainly part of our roadmap. What I would say is I think the way I think of it is AI is going to be critical as we move past this. We have all the tier one supplier data, but we have nothing from 2, 3, 4. I think that's where it's going to play a big role for us as we start gathering data from disparate sources and then using that and bringing it together in a cohesive and a productive manner. So that's the way I think of it in terms of solution we're bringing to market.
And I'll take executive privilege to take the last answer on that one if you guys are good. If you think outside of traceability, we had the panel up here on SOP before, and they were talking a lot about demand planning. I can tell you in the QSR industry, we use the hell out of AI in order to try to predict consumer behaviors and consumer demand based on seasonal patterns, based on urbanities, based on kind of what we think the next hottest trend is going to be. And so all those inputs we put into large scale models, and I laughed a lot when they said, and in the end, you pull that out and put it on an Excel spreadsheet and you do a few more things, because we do that too. But we drop those in and we run lots of scenarios. And then we hope the scenario that we pick is going to be the right one. But if it's not, we've got alternate scenarios that we can move to and shift to quickly that are already planned out based on that model already running and coming out with hundreds of thousands of scenarios, but you're picking probably 4 or 5 that you think will be the behavior that the consumer will give you, and then a supply plan against it, a replenishment plan against it. With that said, I think we've run out of time. Thank you, panelists. Much better experts on this than me. And my only hope is the next time you go to a restaurant or the grocery store, you have a little bit better understanding of where that food comes from. Thank you.